Well, thank you. Thank you, Kristi Raik, and thank you everyone else who's said all kinds of nice things here so far. I'll be the downer for you. So I'm honored to be invited to ICDS's 20th anniversary, and despite my septuagenarian status where every day alive is another gift, I generally find Estonians' obsession with round anniversaries overdone. Everyone's got every 5 years, you know. Nonetheless, to see how an idea that began with a small group of people 2 decades ago has grown into a serious, respected European institution is truly worth celebrating. Congratulations to ICDS. Today I shall try to cram into my little speech how the hell did we get to where Europe is today and what do we have to do about it? My serious title is A Grand Strategy for Europe at the End of Pax Americana. So I'll try to be more serious. And I will end with a plea for ICDS as the premier research institute, research institute in Northern Europe, not only to look at the immediate and short-term developments in our immediate neighborhood and occasionally still threatened neighborhood, but to start thinking about grand strategy, to look beyond immediate security, but the future of this country, but also our region, and of Europe, and more importantly, to assist in creating that future. 20 years ago, when ICDS was founded, Estonia was 2 years into its status as a newbie member of the EU and NATO, still learning the ropes of those two large organizations, generally keeping quiet and our heads down and trying to learn. But we were happy and satisfied. After all, not only were we independent and free, we had made it into the 2 clubs that mattered for our future security and well-being. Sadly, the dismissive arrogance of some countries toward a pre-enlargement Central and Eastern Europe did not diminish with membership. That would not noticeably change until 24 February of 2022. And even today, it's occasionally a slog. Meanwhile, and since ICDS's halcyon founding days of 20 years ago, the erstwhile Kumbaya, peace, love, and Woodstock era in Europe would soon draw to a close. In fact, it was only about 4 months after I assumed office. So I had a short time with Kumbaya. In February 2007, Putin's Munich Security Conference speech declared the Kumbaya era over, and soon we saw what that meant. The debilitating DDoS cyber attacks on Estonia in April 2007, which much of NATO refused to believe happened, and the ensuing riots, which we had to deal with, the disappointing 2008 Bucharest NATO summit, and the Russian invasion of Georgia came in rapid succession. Nonetheless, none of those shocks made a dent in the broader European Wandel durch Handel paradigm of relations with Europe. That was then, this is now. Perceptions have changed, as has the transatlantic relationship. Even the EU has slowly evolved, though, as I will argue later, not enough. First, perceptions of Russia. After the foreign policy obscenity of signing the Nord Stream 2 contract a year and a half after the occupation of Crimea and all the attendant violations of international law, and the Russian shoot-down of MH17, it took the full-scale invasion of Ukraine 4 years ago to change the general view of Russia as a gold mine for European business and the end to old member states offering psychological diagnoses of Central and Eastern European members who had actual empirical knowledge of Russia, wie eigentlich gewesen ist, not the wished-for Russia, the home of that great European cultural icon, Tolstoyevsky. Oh, well. But this leads to the next part, which is Pax Americana passes. What has truly changed, however, is the end of the world all of us here have grown up in or, before 1991, wished to join. The generally rules-based order of the past 80 years, established and more or less maintained by the United States during and after World War II. This is not about the U.S., quote, withdrawing from NATO. There is no need to do that. It can easily remain in with voting rights, but choose to take its troops out. It can even stay or abstain in case Article 5 is invoked by an ally. It's much, much bigger than that. But the old order is dying. Russia and China have been undermining it for 20 years. When we read the U.S. National Security Strategy published in December, or just listen to the pronouncements of senior U.S. officials in the past year, it's clear the U.S. too no longer sees itself as the benign hegemon that will uphold the global order and that the U.S. itself established. Pox Americana was a grand strategy to establish a rules-based international order with the U.S. acting as a benign hegemon. This was the greatest of all grand strategies ever. Pax Romana, 2,000 years ago, was summed up by Tacitus on Rome's final victory over Carthage as, quote, they make a desert and call it peace. The Peace of Westphalia, as well as Augsburg and the principle cuius regio, eius religio, established the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states, which ended the 30 Years' War, but not the interference. The tripartite order, established by the Congress of Vienna in 1815, lasted almost a century until World War I, but that was in reality a division of Europe between autocratic empires that suppressed liberal democracy, while Great Britain's grand strategy instead was to be the world's great maritime power for Britannia to rule the waves and the sea lanes around the globe. But the U.S. strategy was different. The benign hegemon's rule of what we call the West was military, political, economic, diplomatic, and cultural, and even culinary, if we think of the ubiquity in the world all over of hamburgers and Coca-Cola. Promoting free trade and free markets and liberal democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, it went far beyond any earlier grand strategy, and for 80 years it worked, allowing Europe to live, grow, and prosper, as we see all around us. Pax Americana was all-encompassing, not just military or for the purpose of control and domination as earlier grand strategy. It can be summed up in the following example. Escaping in January to Spain's Tenerife, a 40-year-old Finn lies sunbathing on the beach, sipping a gin and tonic, watching his kids frolic in the surf while listening on his AirPods to Bruce Springsteen or Pearl Jam, Beyonce or Lady Gaga, depending on his age or what he listened to. And to express his ultimate satisfaction with this transcendental hedonic Gesamtkunstwerk, he lets out a sigh and says simply, America, which I have been told is what people consider the greatest experience. But Pax Americana is over. What the U.S. created, beginning already in 1944 with the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and GATT, which would later become the WTO. 1945, the U.S. created the UN. These institutions came from the understanding that the US's own failure to establish a structure to bind countries together in the League of Nations after World War I and to rebuild and help Europe economically was also responsible for the horrors that began in the 1920s and 30s, from hyperinflation to the rise of fascism. Its core axiom, though, was the UN's prohibition of aggression as a means to change borders. On the economic side, the US also established the Marshall Plan in 1948. That same year, the slow realization that the USSR was not an ally became explicit with the Berlin blockade. The communist coups d'etat in Central Europe, taking over democratically elected governments in Poland, erstwhile Czechoslovakia and Hungary, led UK Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin to write President Truman asking to create the North Atlantic Treaty that year, which the following year, in 1939, saw the O appended to the treaty, giving us NATO. It was also with US actively pushing Schumann's plan in 1950 for the European coal and steel community, which the US saw as a way to strengthen Western Europe when it was beginning to frazzle a bit. What would eventually become the European Union was hardly to screw America, as President Trump has averred. We can continue. It was the US that created the CSCE, later the OSCE, making the so-called third basket of human rights a fundamental tool to push back on repressive communist regimes. Later, it pushed for NATO enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe, for a Europe whole, free, and at peace, when in reality, many Western European countries were against taking those Eastern Europeans lest it upset Russia and the opportunities it offered as the El Dorado to the east. And it was George Herbert Walker Bush who proclaimed the peace dividend after the fall of communism in 1989 to 91, leading to, which may not be so positive, the massive disarmament of both the United States and Europe in the 1990s. So where are we today in 2026? Policy gurus from the three schools of thinkers in the United States, the isolationist realist, or the balancing realist, the interventionist neocon, and the liberal international school, all have concluded in the last month that America has changed and changed fundamentally, ending its 80-year approach to its relations with the world. Stephen Walt, Dean of America's Foreign Policy Realist School, in his recent Foreign Affairs article, called his country not a benign, but a predatory hegemon. The interventionist neocon thinker of the Iraq War, Robert Kagan, in his recent piece in The Atlantic, called his country the rogue superpower, and titled an earlier piece this year as America Against the World, while former ambassador at the OSCE and the NSC advisor President Biden, Michael Carpenter, titled his recent Foreign Affairs article, The Post-Liberal Superpower. President Vance's speech in Munich last February excoriating European law and choosing to meet the leader of the far-right pro-Russian AfD instead of the chancellor of the host country, Olaf Scholz, was a foreshadowing. This was shortly followed by the United States voting with Russia, North Korea, and Belarus, and 14 other Moscow-friendly countries on the 24th of February against a UN resolution condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine and that called for the return of Ukrainian territory. Suddenly imposing a unilateral Liberation Day tariff regime on the EU left another deep wound. Repeated threats to take over Greenland by force if needed shocked Europe as a punch in its collective face. not bothering to consult with NATO allies on the Iran war, and then turning on them to say the Straits of Hormuz are your problem, not ours, and that we will leave NATO, has put Europe before its biggest challenge since the end of World War II. Indeed, just yesterday, President Trump reiterated that because Denmark would not cede Greenland to the United States, it was, quote, bye-bye to NATO. Pulling out of NATO, of course, is a long-term promise of Donald Trump when in 1987, after returning from his first trip to Moscow, he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe, urging the U.S. to withdraw from NATO. In practice, it's not so easy. It would take a year for such a decision to take place, and since Tim Kaine and nota bene Marco Rubio sponsored the bill preventing the president unilaterally from withdrawing from NATO without a two-thirds supermajority of the Senate. But in reality, it's not necessary to renounce the North Atlantic Treaty. It's simply enough to withdraw the approximately 100,000 U.S. troops based in Europe today. Once the ongoing Department of Defense force posture review is completed, this will probably see a major restructuring anyway, as Secretary of Defense Hegseth promised already last spring. And lastly, if an attack were to take place on a NATO country, there is no automaticity of response. A full NATO response requires consensus, which without U.S. leadership will be somewhat difficult to achieve. And even if that's obtained, it's not at all clear what the U.S. would contribute. So let's leave this discussion behind us and look at where we stand. European policymakers hope that the threat of withdrawal of the U.S. from the world is not a permanent solution or condition, that perhaps it will change with the next administration. I'm not so sure. To base our security on the possible outcome of an election 2.5 years from now seems to be more a case of hopium. Secondly, and equally unclear, is how much even a completely different administration will want to go back to the status quo ante of the transatlantic relationship of yesteryear, or how long it would take to do that given the, to put it mildly, current restructuring of the Departments of State and Defense. And third, and most importantly, I think, do we have that much time? The plethora of estimates, beginning with Secretary General Rutte and then German, Nordic, Baltic, and other militaries of when Russia will be able to attack Europe, we just may not have that much time before 2029. That ultimately depends on how well the war in Ukraine goes. If badly, then we have less time. If well, then we have more time. But deal with it we must. And of course, we also need to account that if the war does go badly for Ukraine, and I unfortunately have not seen much of an analysis on this, that we need to we must also factor in that after the horrors of Bucha, Irpin, and Mariupol, a loss in Ukraine means we would have to deal with up to 35 million refugees to Europe itself. I mean, we think about the trouble that 1.5 million refugees caused in 2015. What will 35 million people do, especially given that after, I mean, they and we should know what will happen when the Russians come in. So, I don't know, does Europe even consider that possibility? I have not seen much publicly, at least. With the U.S. pulling back from Europe, and as we have already described, Europe is left with a wholly new security environment. A recent piece by one of the more interesting American security policy thinkers, Hal Brands, paints 3 different possibilities that follow from an American withdrawal from its previous role as guarantor of the world order and the end of Pax Americana. I quote, "One possibility is a two-world scenario reminiscent of the Cold War in which the globe is divided into dueling blocs led by Washington and Beijing. A second possibility is an age not of two blocs, but of several empires in which an array of potentates capture regional spheres of influence. And a third possibility is a self-help world in which U.S. behavior turns predatory and plunges the system into an anarchic abyss." Again, this is the Henry Kissinger professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins, Hal Brands. These scenarios need not be discrete and mutually exclusive categories. A U.S. that, as the national security strategy argues, is neo-Monrovian, Western Hemisphere-based, but opposed to China, can still act in the interest of empire. A world of empire where China wants the Western Pacific democracies of Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Oceania in its sphere of influence would certainly be opposed only by the U.S., or could be, I'd say. While Russia, having already expanded its sphere of influence to Slovakia, Hungary, perhaps also Czechia, Austria, and most certainly Serbia, will eye, as ever, the rest of Europe, as it has ever since Napoleon, as its own sphere. With the Russophilic Allianz für Deutschland and Rassemblement National, the leading parties in Germany and France, respectively, though out of power today, may be running those countries in the coming years, and we can be certain with considerable help from Russia itself. So I suggest reading Hal Brand's article in Foreign Policy, where he elaborates the implications of these three scenarios, but the message is clear. Europe had better get its act together, get serious about its defense, of which only a fraction has to do with its current state of military readiness. Most of it has to do with the structural limitations of the European economy and the political paralysis we see virtually all the time with those that use their veto to prevent aiding Ukraine or sanctioning Russia, or use the accident of the location of the headquarters of Euroclear to stymie our foreign policy objectives. If anything, looking at how the EU has been falling behind in all realms vital for competition and security, not just military, but in political cohesion, economic growth, and in technology, we need desperately to carry out reforms in a broad range of areas, from energy markets, just to keep us powered enough to actually participate in the rapidly developing world of AI, to unified capital markets, to common borrowing by the EU, to energy market consolidation, to the single market for services. Just as an example, this year, the biggest European investment in artificial intelligence is 1 billion euro by the French company, I don't know if it's AMI or AMI, one of those two, one way or another, either works. In the US, the big four tech giants, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, and Microsoft, along with Oracle, are projected to invest between $660 billion and $690 billion in this year, 2026, nearly doubling their 2025 levels, which meant that the year before, or 2025, it was more than $300 billion. In 2 years, they will spend $1 trillion, while all we have to show, unfortunately, is $1 billion. How can Europe compete when it's clear that the new grand strategy for both the US and for China is to invest massively to become AI, artificial intelligence hegemons, from which, in this brave new world, all else follows? Power, political and military, economic competition, and even the soft power that we see today with America's Facebook and Twitter and China's TikTok. Europe is not even in the game now, and unless we embark on a massive reform effort, Europe will, in the words of Mario Draghi, die a slow, agonizing death. And that's only if we don't have to defend ourselves militarily before that happens. These fundamental reforms, however, require members to give something up. A capital markets union requires smaller countries to accept that it might hurt their national banks. Common borrowing requires the so-called frugals to drop their objections, and the more profligate, indebted countries need to tighten their fiscal policies. Everyone has to agree to QMV in foreign policy. The need for these hard decisions is hardly new. As then President of the European Commission, Jean-Paul Juncker, said some 10 years ago, "We all know what to do, but we don't know how to get reelected once we have done it." The problem of getting reelected touches a small number of politicians, however. What needs to be done affects the lives of at least 450 million Europeans. What specifically needs to be done, and economically, is described in all of its unelectably gory glory in Mario Draghi's report to the European Commission of October 2024. This is what needs to lie at the heart of a European grand strategy. From that, we can also derive our defense and military tasks. We have little time to do any of it. And just some words on defense. With the economy, we face Draghi's slow, agonizing death from a loss of competitiveness. Yet with all the warning signs flashing red from one official statement in Washington on the threatened end of NATO to the next, the EU also has been perhaps even criminally slow to react, as if we don't believe what we read or hear every day. How will we defend Europe without the US in the lead? I haven't seen any real answers or real efforts to do something about it. In addition, my own particular bêtes noires include our failure to revise military doctrine and practice to take into account the drone revolution, and secondly, this bizarre term, hybrid or gray zone warfare, as if we never heard of von Clausewitz's dictum, war is the continuation of policy by other means, including so-called hybrid. Both the latter, as well as dealing with drones, are pure cases of obsolete policies that we haven't bothered really to revise. Last year, here in Estonia, at our annual Hedgehog NATO exercises with 13 NATO nations participating, a 17-man Ukrainian drone unit obliterated an armored infantry unit of 6,000 men. The comment of the British general in charge was, pardon my language, or his, "We're fucked." As for so-called hybrid warfare, we continue at the NATO and EU level to insist warfare is still the same as it was in 1948 or during the Cold War and the North Atlantic Treaty. Article 5 requires an armed attack to be enacted before it can be enacted by its members. Yet what we see across Europe, and especially Northern Europe, are clear attacks that reach neither Article 4 nor 5 thresholds. How can you prove it was the Russians that were asked? Yet they are attacks run by the GRU and other Russian entities. Since they do not rise to the level of Article 4 or 5, they are treated as national responsibilities. Not our problem is what we hear from our two organizations. You deal with it. So, ladies and gentlemen, yes, I'm getting to the end. Beginning in 1944 through 1950, a span of basically 5 years, the United States crafted a serious grand strategy to restore and then uphold, or I can even say create, restore, and then uphold the liberal democratic market and free trade-based Western order. It took half a decade. Now that that order is fading, it is up to Europe to fill the void, if not for others, then at least for ourselves and for our children, and not let mere political parochialism and short-term election gains keep us from action. As Sir Humphrey in Yes Minister said, diplomacy is surviving into the next century. Politics is surviving until Friday afternoon. In conclusion, I thank you for your patience listening to my exhortations. It's been a far cry from the usual festive anniversary speech, but it most definitely is not a festive time in Europe today. After that, all I can wish in the tradition of, well, here we are in this hall of German nobility. In the German tradition, but in Latin, is how you congratulate institutions. Vivat, crescat, floreat, ICDS in aeternum. Thank you. You must all be depressed. You must all be Estonians if you're applauding such a depressing speech.
Thank you. We did expect you to make us think hard. Let's take one quick question before moving to the panel. If there is none from the audience, I would like to use this opportunity myself. You speak about Europe's grand strategy, and you seem to mean the EU,
Yes.
the EU's grand strategy. Can Europe have a grand strategy without including Ukraine in it?
No, you can't, but look, it's shorthand, right? I mean, I can say, well, we also include Norway in this. I mean, I just do that for shorthand. It's not a, actually, my own preference would be that I just left out a whole bunch of things, but things such as various different possible geometries of Europe. I've been thinking lately more about a revised version of that rather obscene paper to exclude Eastern Europe from decision-making of Lammers and Schäuble from 1993, where there was going to be a core Europe, and then there were going to be us outsiders with some of the rights. I think we should go back to a core Europe, not based, however, on when you join the EU, but rather your commitment to the kinds of reforms that need to be made, because I don't think, if you look at Europe today, the original 6, and you look at the current 27, I'm not sure that it's the original 6 that are so wholeheartedly behind the Draghi report, while I think there are quite a few people in the among the so-called new members, who are still called new members 20 years later, 22 years later, who are would be very much on board with the Draghi reforms. And that would, so do we have a variable geometry, as we used to hear about the future of Europe, with some people doing unified markets and some people going for common borrowing, others not going for it? I don't know. I mean, these are all possibilities, but I did have this. I could have gone on for a long, long time, and I decided to spare you all.
Thank you. Thank you once again.
All right.